It was raining hard. The kind of rain that soaks through a jacket in 60 seconds and fills the streets with water that has nowhere to go. The kind of night that makes every delivery take twice as long and pays the same either way. Leo was 28 years old. He had been biking through flooded roads for 40 minutes to deliver food to an address he had been to 3 times before, and that was never a pleasant stop. He knew this because the last 2 times the woman inside had complained, once about the temperature, once about the packaging. He stood on the mansion steps. He rang the bell. The door opened, and she was standing there in silk, and with a wine glass, and she looked at him the way some people look at whether they did not order, like it was an inconvenience they were being forced to acknowledge. She said he was 10 minutes late. She said the food was probably cold, just like his future. She dropped a $20 bill into a muddy puddle while she was taking her bag, deliberately, looking at him while she did it. And she shut the door. Leo stood on those steps and looked at the $20 in the mud. He did not pick it up. He went back to his bike. Now here is what Chloe Harrison did not know about the man she had just humiliated on her front steps. She did not know that he had spent the previous night in a dark apartment reading an eviction notice. She did not know that he had a letter in his jacket, a letter that had been sitting in an envelope for years, written by a man who had died 2 weeks ago, addressed specifically to Leo, and instructed to be opened only when the world had closed all its doors. She did not know who had written the letter. She did not know what was in it. And she definitely did not know that 1 week from that rainy night, she was going to walk into a boardroom expecting to sign the papers that gave her everything her father had built, and find the delivery driver sitting at the head of the table. This story goes further back than that boardroom. It goes back 10 years, to a hospital janitor and an old man in a wheelchair who had not been visited in 3 months. It goes back further than that, to a village in South Carolina, where a woman raised her son by herself and told him things about homes and bricks and memories that he would one day repeat to a billionaire sitting alone on a Wednesday afternoon. This is not a revenge story. It is a story about what happens when one person gives their time to another person who has nothing left to give in return, and what that time is actually worth. Stay with this one. The boardroom scene is coming, and it is not what you think it is going to be. Before we start, like this video if you believe that how you treat the person who can do nothing for you is the truest version of your character. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub. Ring that notification bell. New stories every week. Comment below when Chloe dropped that 20 in the mud. What was your first reaction? Tell us. Let us go back to the beginning of Leo's story. Not the delivery company, not the eviction notice. All the way back to a small house in Grayfield, South Carolina. To a woman named Carol, and a boy who grew up learning that the most valuable thing you could give someone was your attention. Leo Vance grew up in Grayfield, South Carolina, in a town that had a main street, a church, a gas station, and the specific quality of places that produce people who either leave young or stay forever. His mother, Carol Vance, had stayed. Not because she had not wanted more. She had wanted more. She had wanted it with the specific and disciplined hunger of a woman who understood what more looked like from a distance, and who had made peace with the gap between the wanting and the having through the specific mechanism of work. She worked at the county record's office 5 days a week and cleaned 2 houses on weekends. She was the most organized person Leo had ever known, which was not a compliment he gave easily because he had known some organized people. His father had not been in the picture. Not through drama, through absence. He had left before Leo was old enough to have the memory of him leaving, which Carol had always been honest about in the specific way she was honest about everything, directly, without bitterness, as a fact rather than as a wound. She had said when Leo was 8 and asked why, Some people are not built for the long version of things. Your father was the short version. Leo had thought about this. He had said, "What is the long version?" She had said, "This, you staying." He had understood. He had also understood, from that conversation, and from the years of watching Carol, that the long version required something the short version did not: the decision to keep showing up even when showing up was hard. Carol had shown up, every day, for 23 years of showing up after his father decided not to. She had also taught him things. Not formally, she was not a formal teacher. She taught through the specific method of a woman who paid attention to her child and responded to what she saw rather than what she expected. When Leo was 10 and struggling with mathematics, she had not hired a tutor. She had sat with him every evening for 4 months until the mathematics made sense. When he was 12 and got into a fight at school because a boy had been repeatedly unkind to a quieter kid in his class, she had not punished him for fighting. She had said, "Why did you get involved?" He had said, "Because it was not right." She had said, "Did getting involved make it better or worse?" He had said, "Better for him, worse for me." She had said, "That is usually how protecting someone works." He had said, "Is it worth it?" She had thought for a moment. She had said, "Depends on whether you can live with not doing it." He had said, "I could not have." She had said, "Then it was worth it." This was how she taught. The most important thing she taught him was a sentence she said once, on a Tuesday evening when he was 14, when they had been driving past a house on the edge of town where an elderly man lived alone, and that always looked dark inside even in the evenings. She had said, "A house is just bricks, a memory is a home." He had asked what she meant. She had said, "That man in there has a house that is 3 times the size of ours, but we have more home in our kitchen than he has in every room. The difference is not the size. The difference is what happens inside it." He had nodded. He had filed this. He would say it to a man in a wheelchair 14 years later and change the trajectory of both their lives. Grayfield had not had much in the way of technology access when Leo was in school. The county school had one computer lab with 12 machines and a rotating schedule that gave each class 1 hour per week. This was the reality. Leo had understood it as the reality from his first year in that lab. What he had done with that understanding was something most of his classmates had not done. He had found every additional access he could. The county library had 2 computers available for public use. He had been there after school 3 days a week from the time he was 13, not for homework, for the specific exploration of someone who has found a territory that interests him and is mapping it. He had learned, initially, from tutorials and help documentation. He had progressed quickly. By 16, he was doing things on the library computers that required the librarian to ask him twice what exactly he was building. He had been building a simple database for the county records office where his mother worked, a personal project, not commissioned, just built because he had watched her spend 4 hours on a task that a properly organized database would have reduced to 20 minutes, and he had wanted to fix it. The librarian had looked at the database. She had said, "Did you build this yourself?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "How old are you?" He had said, 16. She had called his mother. Carol had come in and looked at the database and then at her son, and had the expression of a woman encountering something she had been raising, but had not fully seen yet. The county records office had used the database for 3 years. His technology teacher in the final year of high school had written in his reference letter, "Leo Vance has a natural understanding of systems that is rare in secondary school students. His instinct is always to find the solution to the real problem rather than the problem as presented. I am confident that wherever he goes from here, this instinct will serve him and the people around him." Leo had not been able to go to university. The scholarship he had applied for, a computer science program at a state university, had offered him a partial award that still left a gap that Carol's salary could not bridge. He had tried to work the gap and had fallen short. He had made a decision. He had told Carol, "I am going to the city. I am going to work and I am going to save and I am going to come back and build the thing I want to build." Carol had looked at him. She had said, "What thing?" He had said, "A tech school, for kids like me. Kids in towns like this who have the ability but not the access." She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "That is a large thing." He had said, "I know." She had said, "It will take a long time." He had said, "I know that too." She had looked at him. She had said, "Then you better get started." He had packed one bag. He had hugged his mother for a long time. He had gotten on a bus. He was 19 years old. The city was Atlanta. He had chosen Atlanta not randomly, but because the specific combination of a growing tech sector and a cost of living that was not yet prohibitive made it the most viable entry point for someone with his profile. He had done this analysis in the library before he left. His first job was warehouse work. 3 months of warehouse work, living in a room he rented from a family who charged less than the going rate because he helped their eldest son with homework 3 evenings a week. This arrangement worked for both parties and lasted until he transitioned. The transition came through a connection he made at a community networking event for young professionals, an event he had found through a flyer at the library. The connection was with a woman named Diane who ran a facilities management company that contracted with several medical buildings in the city's medical district. She needed someone to coordinate the evening cleaning crews at 3 locations. The pay was not spectacular, but it was stable, and it included something that warehouse work did not. Access. Hospital environments have a specific quality that Leo had noticed in his first week. The people who clean them and maintain them become functionally invisible to the professional staff. Not rudely invisible in most cases, just invisible in the way that things you stop noticing become invisible. You pass them in corridors. You speak past them. They are present but not registered. Leo had registered this. He had also registered that invisible people hear things and see things and understand environments in ways that visible people often do not. The invisible people in a hospital know where the difficult patients are, which nurses are exhausted, which doctors are having a hard week, which families are in the most distress. He had started paying attention. Not in a collecting information way, in the way his mother had taught him, by actually seeing the people in front of him. He had been working at Meridian Medical Center for 8 months when he first noticed Mr. Harrison. Edward Harrison was 68 years old and had been a patient in the long-term care wing of Meridian for 6 weeks. He was there for cardiac rehabilitation after a significant event that had required surgery. The rehabilitation program was lengthy. His medical prognosis was excellent according to the charts that Leo could not read officially, but could understand enough of to gather the basic picture from his months of presence on the floor. What his medical prognosis did not account for was his emotional one. Leo had noticed him the way he noticed most things gradually, through the accumulation of small observations. Mr. Harrison sat in the common room in his wheelchair most afternoons. He was always alone. He always had a photograph in his hands, a small, printed photograph of a young woman who was smiling in the way of someone being photographed in a good moment. He did not watch the common room television. He did not engage with the other patients. He was present in the specific way of someone who was waiting for something. On the 4th time Leo had cleaned the common room while Mr. Harrison was there, he had stopped. He had said, "You always have the same picture." Mr. Harrison had looked up. He had said, "You noticed." Leo had said, I notice things. Mr. Harrison had looked at the photograph. He had said, "My daughter, she was 21 here. She is 25 now." Leo had said, "Is she coming to visit?" Mr. Harrison had been quiet. He had said, "She has a busy life." He had said it the way people say things when the real version is different from the version they are presenting. Leo had sat down. He had his cleaning cart. He was on schedule. There were 3 more areas to complete before his break. He had sat down. He had said, "How long has she been busy?" Mr. Harrison had looked at him. He had said, 3 months. Leo had said, "I am sorry." Mr. Harrison had said, "She is waiting." Leo had said, "For what?" Mr. Harrison had been quiet again. He had said, "For me to leave so she can have the keys." This was the specific thing he had said. Leo had held it. He had thought about Carol. He had thought about the dark house on the edge of Grayfield. He had said, "My mom always says, a house is just bricks, a memory is a home. Don't let the bricks make you sad, sir." Mr. Harrison had looked at him for a long time. He had said, "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me since I have been in this building." He had said, "What is your name?" "Leo," he had said. Mr. Harrison had said, "I am Edward." Leo had cleaned the common room. He had come back the next day. He had come back every day after that for the following 7 months. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub. The story of what happened between Leo and Edward over those 7 months is the foundation of everything that comes after. Don't miss a second of it. The conversation started small and became large the way real conversations do, not by design, but by the natural expansion of 2 people who find each other genuinely interesting and who keep coming back. Leo had learned in the first month the basic outline of Edward Harrison's life. He had built Harrison Industries from a logistics company. He had started at 32 with a $200,000 loan from his father-in-law, and an instinct for supply chain efficiency that the industry had not yet fully understood was becoming the most critical element of modern commerce. He had spent 20 years building it through reinvestment and strategic expansion until it had offices in 8 cities and was publicly traded and was, by any measure, one of the 100 most significant mid-cap companies in the country. He had a wife, Margaret, who had died of cancer 12 years before Leo met him. He had a daughter, Chloe, who was 25 and who had grown up in the shadow of a company that her father loved, and in the light of a mother who had been warm and present and who was gone. He had a heart that had, literally and figuratively, started failing in the past year. He had an enormous amount of money. He had nobody to talk to. Leo had said, after hearing most of this in the first 3 weeks, "How do you have nobody to talk to with all of that?" Edward had looked at him. He had said, "Money attracts people who want to talk to your money, not to you." Leo had said, "Does your daughter want to talk to your money?" Edward had been quiet. He had said, "I think she stopped wanting to talk to me a long time before the money became the problem." He had looked at the photograph. He had said, "Margaret could talk to her. I never knew how. The company was always there. I thought the company was providing for her. She thought the company was replacing her. I did not understand the difference until Margaret was gone and I was alone with my daughter and we were strangers." He had said, "She is waiting for me to die. She is not a bad person. She is a person I failed to know, and now neither of us knows how to close that gap." Leo had said, "Have you tried?" Edward had said, "In the ways I know how, she does not receive them well." Leo had said, "What ways do you know how?" Edward had thought. He had said, "Business ways, practical ways, arrangements, provisions." Leo had said, "Have you tried the other ways?" Edward had said, "What other ways?" Leo had said, Have you called her and just said, "I miss you"? Not about the estate or the company, just those 3 words. Edward had been quiet for a long time. He had said, "I do not know how to do that." Leo had said, "I do not know how to code in Python yet either. I am learning it." Edward had looked at him. He had said, "You are suggesting that I learn to talk to my daughter the same way you are learning to code." Leo had said, "I am suggesting that not knowing how to do something is a reason to start practicing, not a reason to conclude you cannot." Edward had been quiet. He had picked up the photograph. He had said, "She was a beautiful baby. Margaret brought her home from the hospital and I held her for 20 minutes and then I had to go back to work. I missed the first 3 months because we were closing a major contract. I told myself I would make it up. I never did." Leo had said nothing. He had understood that sometimes the right response to something is silence. They had sat together in the common room for another hour without speaking. The tech school had come up in the 2nd month. Leo had mentioned it in the context of explaining where he was going, not where he was now, with the cleaning cart and the hospital schedule, but where he intended to end up. He had described it simply: a school for kids in underserved communities, small towns, rural areas, neighborhoods and cities where the technology access gap was widest, where children who had the ability but not the resources could learn coding, software development, and digital skills in a structured environment. He had not described it as a charity. He had described it as an investment in a category of talent that the world was leaving behind. Edward had listened. He had said, "What is your funding model?" Leo had said, "I do not have one yet. I am still working on the early capital." Edward had said, "Where are you with the early capital?" Leo had said, "I have saved enough for a year of rent in a modest space. I need more for equipment and staffing and program development." Edward had said, "How much more?" Leo had named a number. Edward had said, "That is a realistic number." He had said, "You have thought about this carefully." Leo had said, "I have been thinking about it since I was 19. Edward had looked at him. He had said, "Why haven't you started?" Leo had said, "I want to do it correctly. I do not want to start something I cannot sustain." Edward had nodded. He had said, "That is the right instinct. Most people start before they are ready and patch problems afterward. The businesses that last are the ones that launched with a proper foundation." Leo had said, "That is what I am building." Edward had looked at him for a moment. He had said, "Have you considered an investor?" Leo had said, "I do not have the kind of network that connects people like me to investors." Edward had said, "You are connected to one right now." Leo had looked at him. Edward had said, "I have funded 43 businesses in the last 20 years. Most of them were not remarkable. 3 of them were. You know what the 3 remarkable ones had in common?" Leo had said, "What?" Edward had said, "The people behind them were not doing it for the money. They were doing it because the thing needed to exist, and they were the person who understood why it needed to exist." He had looked at Leo. "You are that person for this idea." Leo had said, "Mr. Harrison." Edward had said, "I am not offering you money. I am telling you something. When the time is right, the conversation about money will happen. Right now I am telling you, you have the right idea and you are thinking about it correctly." Leo had said, "Why are you telling me this?" Edward had said, "Because you told me a house is just bricks, and I wanted to return the favor." The months had continued. Edward had gotten stronger. The cardiac rehabilitation was working. He had eventually graduated from the wheelchair to a cane and from the long-term care wing to a series of outpatient appointments. He had gone home. He had not stopped talking to Leo. He had come back to the hospital on 2 occasions, not for his own treatment, to find Leo on shift and continue a conversation they had been having. On the first return visit, he had come to tell Leo that he had called Chloe. He had said, "I said the 3 words." Leo had said, "How did she respond?" Edward had been quiet. He had said she was surprised. Then she was silent for a long time. Then she said she had to go. Leo had said, "Did she hang up angry?" Edward had said, "No, she said she would call back." Leo had said, "Did she?" Edward had said, "Not yet, but she will." He had said it with the quiet conviction of someone who has decided to believe something, because the alternative is too hard to live inside. He had looked at Leo. He had said, "I want to give you something." He had taken an envelope from his jacket. The envelope was sealed with wax and had Leo's name written on the front in the specific handwriting of someone who had gone to a school where handwriting was taught seriously. He had said, "Do not open this now. Open it when you feel the world has closed all its doors." Leo had taken it. He had said, "What is in it?" Edward had said, "Something I have been thinking about for 4 months." Leo had said, "Should I be worried?" Edward had said, "No, you should be patient." He had said, "I am not good at patience." Edward had said, "I know, that is why you should practice it." He had shaken Leo's hand. He had walked out. Leo had put the envelope in his jacket. He had kept it there for 3 weeks. Then he had moved it to a more permanent location, a drawer in his apartment, under a folded shirt. He had moved apartments twice in the following years. The envelope had moved with him each time. Edward Harrison had died 8 years after that hospital visit. Leo had not been there at the end. He had found out the way people find out about deaths in the age of internet news, a brief article in a business publication. Edward Harrison, founder of Harrison Industries, passed away Monday. He is survived by his daughter, Chloe Harrison. Leo had sat with his phone for a long time. He had thought about the common room at Meridian Medical Center. He had thought about the photograph. He had thought about a man who had called his daughter and said 3 words and waited for her to call back. He had not known, in those 10 years since the hospital, what had happened between Edward and Chloe. He had moved cities twice for work, Atlanta to Charlotte to Nashville, and had progressed from janitorial work to delivery driving, which paid better and gave him more flexibility, though not significantly better prospects. He had stayed in contact with Edward through occasional letters and one phone call that had happened by coincidence when Leo had been back in Atlanta for a week. In that phone call, Edward had said, "The school, you are still working toward it." Leo had said, "Every week." Edward had said, "Good." He had said, "The envelope is still with you." It was not a question. Leo had said, "Yes." Edward had said, "Keep it close." Leo had said, "I will." He had said, "Edward, did Chloe ever call back?" A pause. Edward had said, "Once, last year, she called to tell me her mother's jewelry needed to be in her keeping for insurance purposes." A longer pause. Leo had said, "I am sorry." Edward had said, "I stopped waiting for the other call. I accepted what I had." He had been quiet. He had said, "I would rather spend my energy on the things that are still possible." Leo had said, "Like what?" Edward had said, "Like making sure that when I go, the right things go to the right people." Leo had not fully understood this at the time. He had understood it on the night of the eviction notice. 10 years after the hospital corridor. Leo was 28 years old and had been in Nashville for 3 years and had been delivering food for 18 months. The delivery work was the third job in 3 years. Before it, he had been doing tech support at a call center, which had paid better but had required a certainty about staying in the city that had not been available when his landlord had raised the rent by 40%, and he had needed to find a cheaper situation in a different neighborhood. The cheaper situation had required a different commute that the call center schedule could not accommodate. He had taken the delivery job. It was not the plan. The plan, which he had been working toward in the fragments of time that his working schedule produced, was still the tech school. He had savings, not enough, but more than he had started with. He had a notebook of research. He had contacts in the education technology community that he had built through attending every free event and conference he could access in the past 4 years. He had the foundation of something. What he did not have was enough. And the eviction notice had arrived on a Monday morning, which meant that the insufficient enough had just become smaller. He had owed 2 months. His landlord, a man named Gary who had been fined for 2 years and had become not fine when he had switched property management companies, had given him until Monday. It was Tuesday. He had been doing deliveries since 6 in the morning. He had been on the 19th delivery when the address came up, and he had recognized it, and his stomach had done the small thing it always did when the address came up. The Harrison estate. He had been there twice before, both times unpleasant. Both times he had biked away thinking about what Carol had said about the long version and the short version of people. The rain had been coming down heavy since noon. He had pulled up his hood and gotten on his bike. The door had opened and there she was. Chloe Harrison at 25 was the photograph made real, the same bone structure, the same quality of presence that photographs capture and then distort slightly. She was dressed in silk and holding wine, and looking at him with an expression that was the specific expression of a person for whom delivery drivers existed as a category rather than as individuals. He had explained about the flooded roads. She had not listened. She had said the thing about his future. She had dropped the 20 into the puddle. She had shut the door. Leo had stood on the steps for a full 10 seconds. He had looked at the 20 in the mud. He had looked at the door. He had thought about Edward Harrison sitting alone in a wheelchair with a photograph of this woman and saying she hasn't visited in 3 months. He had thought, this is who you became. He had not said it to the door. He had gotten back on his bike. He had gotten home at 9:30. He was wet through. He had changed his clothes. He had sat on the edge of his bed. He had looked at the eviction notice on the table. He had thought about the delivery company's schedule for the next week and had run the numbers on whether there was any version of the next 7 days that produced enough to cover 2 months of rent. There was no version. He had opened the drawer. He had taken out the shirt. He had taken out the envelope. He had held it for a minute. He had thought, I think the world has closed all its doors. He had opened it. There were 3 things inside. The first was a letter. It was 3 pages, handwritten in the same careful script as his name on the envelope. He had read it twice before he understood the full scope of what it was saying. Edward had written about the 7 months in the hospital. He had described, from his own perspective, what those afternoons had meant to him. He had described the specific quality of being seen as a person rather than a portfolio, the specific relief of conversations that were not about money or legacy or the company, but about bricks and memories and children in small towns who deserved better access. He had written, I have spent 40 years making decisions about capital allocation. Most of them were correct by the financial metrics I was trained to use. Some of them were correct by the human metrics I learned too late. The decision I am communicating in this envelope is the most correct by both metrics that I have ever made. The second thing was a legal document. It was 12 pages long and had been prepared by a law firm Leo had never heard of. It was a codicil, an addition to Edward Harrison's will that had been signed, witnessed, and filed with the probate court. The codicil named Leo Vance as the beneficiary of a block of shares in Harrison Industries that represented 37% of the total outstanding shares of the company. 37%. Leo had read this number 4 times. He had gone to the third thing. The third thing was a key. A small silver key with a tag that had a bank's name and a vault number written on it. He had gone back to the legal document. At the bottom of the last page, in Edward's own handwriting rather than the legal text, the vault holds the documentation for the foundation I established in the company's name. The foundation's purpose is the construction and operation of technology schools in underserved communities. You told me what the schools needed to be when you were 20 years old in a hospital common room. I wrote it down. It is in the vault. You just need to build it. Leo had put the document down. He had looked at his apartment. The eviction notice on the table. The wet jacket on the chair. The drawer where the envelope had been for 10 years. He had called Patricia Osai's number, the number on the legal document's header. She had answered on the second ring. He had said, "My name is Leo Vance." She had said, "I have been expecting your call, Mr. Vance." The woman he had not yet mentioned was named Maya Chen. She was 27 years old and worked as a legal associate at Patricia Osai's firm, which was the firm that had handled Edward Harrison's estate. Leo had met her on the Thursday after the envelope, the first meeting at the firm where the scope of the inheritance was explained and the documentation was walked through. She had been in the meeting as a supporting associate. Her role was primarily document management, ensuring the papers were correctly ordered and that the process moved through the probate requirements on schedule. She had not said much in that first meeting. Leo had noticed her because she had been the only person in the room who had looked at his face, rather than the documents when Patricia was explaining the inheritance's scope. Everyone else had been watching the papers. She had been watching him. Not in a calculating way, in the way of someone who understood that information of this magnitude was landing on a person and was curious about how a person received it. He had caught her eye once. She had not looked away immediately. After the meeting in the hallway, he had said, "Are you watching to see if I fall apart?" She had said, "I was watching to see if you were going to." He had said, "And?" She had said, "You are not going to fall apart, you are organizing." He had said, "How can you tell?" She had said, "The way you took notes during the briefing. Most people receive news like this and stop taking notes because the information is so large. You started writing faster." He had looked at her. He had said, "That is very perceptive." She had said, "I studied people in college before I studied law." He had said, "What did you study people for?" She had said, "My mother taught middle school in a rural county in Georgia. I spent 4 years watching her work and trying to understand what made some kids reachable and others not." Leo had been very still. He had said, "What did you conclude?" She had said, "Whether they had been seen, whether someone had looked at them and said, 'I see you specifically, not you as a category.'" He had looked at her. He had thought about the common room. He had thought about Edward in the wheelchair with the photograph. He had said, "I need to tell you something about a man named Edward Harrison." She had said, "I know about Mr. Harrison, I handled his file." He had said, "I do not mean the file, I mean the man." She had looked at him. She had said, "I would like to hear that." They had sat in the firm's small conference room for 2 hours. He had told her about the hospital, about the photograph, about the bricks and the memory, about the tech school dream and the envelope and 10 years of carrying it. She had listened the way his mother listened, fully, without managing what came next until what was being said was finished. At the end she had said, "He chose well." Leo had said, "He chose because I was the only one who came." She had said, "That is why he chose well." They had walked out of the firm together at 7 in the evening. He had said, "Do you want to get dinner?" She had said, "The shareholder of a major company asking a junior associate to dinner is a complicated situation from an ethics standpoint. He had said, "What if I am not asking as a shareholder?" She had said, "Then it is less complicated." He had said, "I am asking as a person who has just had the most significant day of his life, and who would like to spend the rest of it talking to someone who knows what the day was actually about rather than what it looks like on paper." She had looked at him. She had said, "That is a good reason." They had gotten dinner. They had talked until the restaurant closed. Subscribe to Tribal Taile's Hub. The boardroom scene is the next section, and it is not the ending. What happens after is the part nobody sees coming. The reading of the will had been scheduled for 10 days after Leo's call to Patricia. In those 10 days, Chloe Harrison had been managing the estate proceedings with the specific efficiency of someone who had been thinking about this moment for a long time. She had a plan. The plan was to finalize the inheritance, secure the majority stake in Harrison Industries, and sell the company. She had already had 3 conversations with private equity firms who were interested. The most serious conversation had been with a group in New York who had offered a number that was, by any reasonable measure, significant. She had planned what she was going to wear to the signing. She had planned what she was going to say to the board. She had not been in contact with her father in the months before his death. Not because she had not thought about calling. She had thought about calling several times. She had not because the gap had grown to a size that felt uncrossable without an event, and she had been waiting for an event. The event had been his death. She had stood at his grave and felt something she had not anticipated. Not grief in the simple sense, but the specific grief of a door that has closed before you could walk through it. The specific grief of a person who was waiting for the right moment and had run out of moments. She had not shown this to anyone. She had managed the funeral with the efficiency she brought to everything, and had moved into the estate proceedings with the same efficiency. The boardroom at Harrison Industries' Nashville headquarters was on the 11th floor of the building. Edward had built on land he had purchased in 2001, when Nashville was a different city. Chloe arrived 15 minutes early. She sat at the head of the table. She looked at the room her father had been in for 30 years, the room where the company had been built. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She felt something else. She put it away. The board members arrived. The lawyers arrived. Patricia Ose arrived. Chloe had nodded at Patricia. She had said, "Let's begin." Patricia had said, "We are waiting for one more party." Chloe had said, "Who?" Patricia had said, "The other primary beneficiary." Chloe had said, "There is only one primary beneficiary." The door had opened. Leo walked into the Harrison Industries boardroom in a navy suit that he had bought 2 days before. Not borrowed, bought. He had paid for it with the first funds that had been released from the estate documentation, a prepayment against the inheritance that Patricia had arranged when it became clear the timing was right. He had chosen it with Maya, who had come with him to the store and who had looked at 3 options and said, "The Navy one. It is direct without performing." He had said, "I want to look like the person I actually am." She had said, "The Navy one is the person you actually are." He had worn it. He had walked into the boardroom and had been completely calm in the way of someone who has had 10 days to process something, and has used those 10 days to process it correctly rather than performing the processing. He had looked at the room. He had seen Chloe at the head of the table. She had seen him. He had watched her face do the sequence of recognitions. The face. The rain. The delivery. The muddy $20 bill. The expression on her face when she had said the thing about his future. He had seen her put these things together. He had sat down in the chair to Patricia's right. Chloe had said, "Is this a joke?" She had said it without the wine and silk contempt of the doorstep. She had said it with the voice of someone who was genuinely trying to understand what was happening and had not found the correct frame for it yet. Patricia had said, "Ms. Harrison, this is Mr. Leo Vance. He has been named in your father's will as a primary beneficiary." Chloe had said, "I am the only primary beneficiary. I am his daughter." Patricia had said, "You are listed as the primary beneficiary of the estate's real property, including the family residence and its contents, and a guaranteed annual income drawn from the trust." Chloe had said, "And the company." Patricia had said, "The company's controlling shares have been separately allocated." The lawyer, a different attorney, the estate's probate counsel, had opened his folder. He had read the codicil. Not all 12 pages, the relevant portion. He had read, "To my daughter Chloe, I leave the home that her mother loved, the things that will remind her of who we were before I failed to stay present, and enough to live on comfortably for the rest of her life. I love her. I failed to show her correctly, and I am sorry for that. I hope the house holds more warmth for her than it did for me in the final years." He had continued, "To Leo Vance, whom I met when he was 19 years old and who sat with me for 7 months and talked to me about bricks and memories when I had lost the ability to feel the difference between them, I leave the 37% controlling interest in Harrison Industries. Not because he will make more money from it than Chloe would, because he will make more meaning from it. He told me what he wanted to build and I wrote it down, and it is in the vault and it is waiting. Use it, Leo, build those schools." The room was quiet. Chloe had looked at the table. She had been very still. She had said, "He barely knew you." Leo had said, "He knew me for 7 months in a hospital. I came every day. He was alone." Chloe had said, "He manipulated an old man." Leo had said, "Chloe." She had looked at him. He had said, "I came to the hospital every day for 7 months and never asked him for anything. I talked to him because he was alone and talking to him was the right thing to do. That is the whole story." He had looked at her. He had said, "I was at your door 10 days ago in the rain. You told me the food was cold. You said it was like my future. You dropped $20 in a puddle while looking at me." She had not looked away. He had said, "I am telling you this not to make you feel bad. I am telling you this because it matters. Not what it means for me. I do not care what it means for me. It matters because your father sat in a wheelchair every afternoon looking at your photograph wondering if you would come. He loved you. He was bad at showing it, but he loved you." She had been very still. He had said, "He called you once and said 3 words. You were surprised and you went quiet and then you said you had to go. He told me that. He said he stopped waiting for the return call." Chloe's jaw had moved. Something had happened in her face that she was working hard to control. He had said, "The last thing he wanted was for you to feel what that felt like from the other side. That is why you have the house and the income. He wanted you to be okay. He just wanted the company to do the thing he wished he had done when it mattered." She had said, "What do you mean?" He had said, "The tech schools. I told him about them when I was 19. He remembered every detail. He funded the foundation and designed the program framework and put it in a vault for 10 years waiting for me to open an envelope." He had said, "The company is not being sold. It is going to continue operating, and it is going to fund what your father believed in when he was finally given someone to believe in." The room had been completely quiet. Chloe had looked at the table. She had said finally, very quietly, "He remembered what you told him." Leo had said, word for word. She had said, "He never remembered anything I told him." Leo had said, "He remembered what people told him when he was paying attention. He was not always paying attention. In the hospital, he was paying attention." A long silence. Chloe had said, "What happens to me?" Leo had looked at her. He had said, "I have a proposal." The proposal Leo had put to Chloe in the boardroom was not the one the story might suggest. He had not offered her a bottom-rung delivery job. He had offered her something harder. He had said, "I am not running a company. I have never run a company. What I have is a plan for what the foundation needs to do and a detailed knowledge of one part of the problem it is trying to solve. Harrison Industries has 37 years of operational infrastructure and a team that knows how to run itself. What it needs is leadership that understands the mission." He had said, "The foundation is going to need a director, not a nominal director, a working one, someone who understands the Harrison family's legacy and who has the credibility that comes with that legacy and who is willing to do the actual work of building what your father funded." Chloe had looked at him. She had said, "You are offering me the foundation." He had said, "I am offering you the work. The foundation comes with the work." He had said, "You do not have to take it. The income from the trust is real and you can live on it comfortably. You have the house. You can do whatever you choose to do." He had paused. He had said, "But I think you are capable of more than whatever you were planning to do with the company sale. And I think somewhere inside you there is a person who wants to do something that your father would have remembered." She had been quiet for a very long time. She had said, "I do not know how to run a foundation." He had said, "Neither do I. We are both going to learn." She had said, "Why would you want me involved?" He had said, "Because this is your father's legacy, not mine. I am the custodian. You are the inheritor. Both things can be true at the same time." She had looked at him. She had said, "You do not hate me for the $20. He had said, "The $20 was not about me. It was about a version of you that I think you have been living inside for a long time because it was the only version available in the house you grew up in." She had said, "You sound like you knew my father well." He had said, "Well enough to understand where some of it came from." She had been quiet. She had said, "I need to think about it." He had said, "Of course." He had stood up. He had said, "Whatever you decide, take the house. It has your mother's things in it. Your father said he left it so you would have more warmth than he did." She had not said anything. He had walked out. Chloe had called Patricia Osei 3 days later. She had said, "I want to talk about the foundation role." Patricia had said, "I expected your call." Chloe had said, "Why?" Patricia had said, "Because your father knew you better than you thought he did." Chloe had been quiet. She had said, "He thought I would take the role." Patricia had said, "He wrote it into the notes he gave me for the foundation setup. He said, if she is given the right invitation, she will come." Chloe had not responded immediately. Patricia had said, "He called it the right invitation. He meant an invitation that was about something real, not about appearances." Chloe had said, "He described me that way to you." Patricia had said, "He described you as someone who had never been given a real reason. He believed that if you had a real reason, you would be capable of everything he was capable of and more." Chloe had been quiet for a long time. She had said, "He should have told me that." Patricia had said, "Yes, he should have." She had said, "He was not good at that kind of thing." Chloe had said, "No." Patricia had said, "Neither was he when it mattered most. I think that is what the foundation is, in some ways. His attempt to say the thing he did not know how to say while he was alive." A very long pause. Chloe had said, "I will take the role." The Harrison Tech Foundation launched 8 months after the boardroom meeting. It had taken 8 months because Leo had insisted on doing it correctly, the same way he had been insisting on doing it correctly for 10 years. The program framework from Edwards Vault had been detailed and specific, and had required adaptation to the current landscape and current technology requirements. But the core of it was exactly what Leo had described at 19 in a hospital common room. schools in underserved communities. Real schools, not outreach programs, not single-day workshops, permanent facilities with equipment, qualified teachers, and a program that ran continuously and that was free to attend. The first one was in Grayfield, South Carolina. This had not been in Edward's notes. Leo had decided this himself. He had gone home to Grayfield 3 weeks after the boardroom meeting, on a Thursday, and had walked into the county records office. His mother had been at her desk. She had looked up. She had said, "Leo." He had said, "Hi, Mama." She had stood up and held him for a long time. He had told her everything. She had listened. At the end she had said, "A house is just bricks." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "You told that to a man in a hospital." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "And he built schools because of it." He had said, "He built the foundation. I am going to build the schools." She had looked at him. She had said, "The first one." He had said, "Grayfield." She had been very still. She had said, "For the kids at the county library." He had said, "For every kid who goes to the library because it is the only access they have." Carol had looked out the window at the county records office. She had said, "Your grandmother would have loved this." He had said, "I know." She had said, "When does it open?" He had said, 8 months. She had said, "Will I get to see it?" He had said, "You are going to be at the opening." She had said, "Is that a promise?" He had said, "It is the long version of a promise." She had understood what he meant. Maya had been the one who helped him write the letter. Not in the sense of drafting it, in the sense of being the person he talked to while he figured out what to say, which had been going on for 4 months, and which had produced something between them that was not the formal result of a planned relationship, but the natural result of 2 people who kept talking and found each other more interesting the more they talked. She had been at the foundation's first planning session. She had been at the Grayfield site visit where they had walked through the building that was going to become the school, and she had said, "The light in this room is excellent. Kids are going to like working in here." He had said, "How do you know what kids will like?" She had said, "My mother taught middle school. I spent 4 years visiting her classroom. Kids like light and space and the feeling that someone thought carefully about where they were going to be." He had looked at the room. He had said, "Someone did." She had looked at him. She had not said anything. He had said, "I want to ask you something." She had said, "You have been building toward asking me something for 4 months." He had said, "I have been building toward asking you something for about 4 months, yes." She had said, "You could just ask it." He had said, "I am asking it now." He had asked it. She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "The delivery driver who became a foundation chair asking the legal associate who handled his inheritance file." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "That is a complicated situation from an ethics standpoint." He had said, "I resigned from the firm as a client 3 weeks ago. Patricia has been handling the ongoing foundation matters in a different capacity." She had looked at him. She had said, "You thought about that?" He had said, "I think about things carefully." She had said, "Yes." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Yes to which part?" She had said, "Both." The letter to Edward had taken 3 evenings to write. He had sat at the desk in the apartment he was no longer going to be evicted from. He had moved to a different apartment, not a mansion, a proper apartment with enough space for a desk and a kitchen that worked and a bookshelf, and he had written to the man in the wheelchair. He had not known what to say at first. He had started 3 times and thrown away 3 starts. On the 4th try he had written, "I opened the envelope." He had written about the boardroom. He had written about Chloe and the foundation, and what she had said when Patricia told her he believed she was capable of it. He had written about Grayfield. He had written about Carol. He had written about Maya. He had written about the library at 14 and the database and the bus to Atlanta and the warehouse and the hospital corridor and the afternoon in the common room when he had sat down beside a man with a photograph. He had written, "I do not know if you can hear any of this. I think that you probably cannot in the way that people describe. But I know that you built this for me, and I know that you wrote down what I told you when I was 19, and I know that somewhere in the year before you died you opened that vault and made sure everything was ready for the day I opened the envelope." He had written, "I want to tell you something about that day. I had a delivery that night before I found the envelope. I was wet and I was broke, and I had just been told that my future was cold, and I went home, and I opened the envelope, and I understand now what you meant when you said open it when the world has closed all its doors." He had written, "You did not just leave me money, you left me a reason. The schools are not the reason. The schools are what the reason makes possible." He had written, "The reason is what you said in the common room that last afternoon before you were discharged. You said, 'I would rather spend my energy on the things that are still possible.' You were talking about Chloe. You did not know you were also talking about me and what I was going to do with the next 10 years. He had written, "I spent my energy on the things that are still possible. The first school opens in 4 months in a town in South Carolina, where a woman who taught me everything she knows goes to work every day at the county record's office." He had written, "We are building those schools, Mr. Harrison." He had folded the letter. He had put it in an envelope. He had written Edward's name on the front. He had walked to the cemetery. He had placed the envelope on the grave. He had stood there for a while. He had not said much. He had thought about bricks and memories, and the difference between a house and a home. He had thought about what Carol had meant when she said it. He had thought about what he had meant when he repeated it in a hospital corridor to a man in a wheelchair. He had thought about what Edward had understood from it. He had thought the bricks are being laid. He had walked home. Maya had been at the apartment when he got back. She had looked at his face. She had said, "Are you okay?" He had said, "Yes." He had said, "Come on, I want to show you the Grayfield floor plans again. I think we need to adjust the computer station layout." She had said, "It is 10 o'clock." He had said, "I know, is that a problem?" She had looked at him. She had said, "For someone who just came back from a cemetery, you are very focused." He had said, he would have wanted me to be focused. She had sat down with him. They had worked until midnight on the Grayfield floor plans. The computer station layout was adjusted. So that is Leo Vance. And the $20 bill in a muddy puddle. And a woman who dropped it while looking at him, to make a point about where he was relative to where she was. And a man who left it there. Not because he was making a statement. Because he had learned from a mother and from a man in a wheelchair and from 10 years of carrying an envelope in a drawer under a folded shirt, that the things that were being offered to him by people who wanted to diminish him were not worth the bend of the knees required to pick them up. He was already bending his knees. Every morning at 5:45, when he got on his bike. Every delivery through every kind of weather to every kind of door. Every evening in the library working toward a thing he could not yet afford to build. He was bending his knees for something worth bending them for. The $20 was not worth it. Let me say something about Chloe that is not about the doorstep. Chloe Harrison had grown up in a house where the most important person in it was a company. Not her father, a company. Her father had loved her. He had also been absent in the specific way of people who put their energy into the thing they know how to build rather than the person they do not know how to reach. She had responded to this by learning to be hard. Not mean at the core, hard at the surface. The specific hardness of a person who has been told over and over by the structure of their childhood that the things that are valuable are the things that look valuable. The cars, the estates, the wine, the performances of status. She had put her energy into those things because the things she had actually wanted, her father's attention, her mother back, the warmth that the house had had before Margaret died, none of that was available by the time she was old enough to reach for it. The foundation was the first thing she had been given that was real. Not given in the sense of handed to her, given in the sense of being available to be earned. She was earning it. Not quickly, not easily. The work of building something from the inside rather than managing its appearance was harder than she had expected. It required the specific humility of someone learning a new skill from the beginning. She was learning. 6 months into the foundation role, she had called Leo on a Sunday evening. She had said, "I went to the Grayfield site." He had said, "What did you think?" She had said, "The light in the computer room is excellent." He had said, "Someone told me that." She had said, "Leo." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I found letters he wrote in the house to my mother before she died." Leo had been quiet. She had said, "He wrote to her about me. He described me in ways he never said to my face, things he noticed, things he was proud of. He just did not know how to say them out loud." Leo had said, "I know." She had said, "He told you." He had said, "Not in those words, in the way he held your photograph." She had been quiet. She had said, "I want to tell you something." He had said, "Okay." She had said, "The night at the door, the $20. He had said, "You do not need to." She had said, "I want to say it." He had waited. She had said, "I was cruel to you, and I was not cruel to you specifically. I was cruel to the person in front of me, which happened to be you, because cruelty at a door where you feel safe is something you do when you have been angry for a long time and you do not know where to put the anger." She had said, "I am sorry." Leo had said, "I know." She had said, "You knew then." He had said, "Not then, now I know. Then I just left the 20. She had said, "Why did you leave it?" He had said, "Because picking it up would have required me to decide it defined something about me. It did not define anything about me." She had been quiet. He had said, "Chloe, your father loved you. He just loved you badly. Those are two different things, and the one that matters is the one you can build on." She had said, "Is there something to build on?" He had said, "You are building it." A long pause. She had said, "How do you stay this calm about everything?" He had said, "I had a lot of wet deliveries." She had laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was the laugh of a person who was beginning, slowly, to find the long version of themselves. The first school opened on a Saturday in September. It was in Grayfield. The ribbon was cut by Carol Vance, who wore the dress she had been saving for the occasion that she had not known was coming. 47 children from the county attended the first orientation. 3 of them had been going to the county library after school for access to the computers there. One of them was 12 years old and had started, on her own, building a simple database for her mother's crafting business. Leo had talked to her for 20 minutes after the orientation. She had shown him the database on her school tablet. He had looked at it. He had said, "How did you learn to do this?" She had said, "I taught myself." He had said, "Did anyone tell you it was good?" She had said, "The librarian looked at it." He had said, "What did the librarian say?" The girl had said, "She said I should keep working on it." Leo had looked at the database. He had said, "She was right. You should keep working on it, and starting next week you have a proper place to work on it." The girl had looked around the school. She had said, Did you build this? Leo had said, a man I knew a long time ago built it. I just finished it. She had said, what was his name? Leo had looked at the light coming through the windows of the room. He had thought about a wheelchair, a photograph, an afternoon in a hospital common room where a cleaning cart had been left standing at the door, while a 19-year-old sat down next to a lonely old man and told him that a house was just bricks. He had said his name was Edward. She had said, was he nice? Leo had said, he was a man who gave me his time when he had nothing left but silence. That is the nicest thing a person can do. She had looked at him. She had gone back to her tablet. Leo had walked to the window. Maya had come and stood beside him. He had said nothing. She had said nothing. They had looked at the room together, the light and the computers and the 47 children, and the librarian from the county library who had come and who was moving between desks answering questions. It was a home, not a house. A home. If this story reached you, like it right now. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub and ring the notification bell. Every week we have a story about the gap between what someone looks like and what they have been building, about the envelopes that people carry for years, about the men and women who sit in wheelchairs in hospital common rooms with photographs, and the people who stop their cleaning carts and sit down. Share this with someone who is carrying something, someone who is doing the work without the recognition, someone who was told their future was cold by a person who had no idea who they were talking to. Comment below. Tell us about a person who believed in you when they had nothing to gain from it. Tell us their name. We read every comment and we want to know. This is Tribal Tales Hub. The $20 stayed in the mud. The school is in Grayfield. And a girl who taught herself to build databases on a tablet at the county library just got a room with excellent light. That is what the envelope was worth. We will see you in the next story.